We are long overdue for a BIOS update. So today we're going to be updating the BIOS in the Gigabyte TRX40 Designare motherboard. Now with all the stuff we've been working on, I kind of let this slip by me. But the reason we need to do that is because we're stepping back so we can step forward. We've got to take care of what's going to happen with the next Titan Ridge card. We have the Titan Ridge Revision 1 that came with the motherboard. And we also have a Titan Ridge Revision 2 that needs some attention, still Thunderbolt 3. And I found something interesting that a couple of people had mentioned that I didn't understand. I thought they were talking about the cable. No, there's a pinout that's different on the Revision 1 versus the Revision 2. So I'm going to get into that in another video. But right now on this one, the title list, we're going to be working on the TRX40 Designare, and we're going to go up to BIOS F5a and lowercase. Let me show you. The BIOS update we're going to do because we've got to go from what we currently have, and it looks like we may need to step through two BIOSes, F4 to get up to F5a. And for those viewers that watch this specifically for the TRX40, this is specific. And I will point out that we are on Revision 1 of the motherboard. Whatever BIOS you do, make sure not only brand model, but also revision, because different revisions have different BIOS versions. And what's important about this generically is you want to step through those updates. That's really important where you've got integration like we're going to have with Thunderbolt 3 and the motherboard. Now, even though I'm concerned about that integration, in the next video, I'm going to do something a little bit different with an experimentation to see what will happen if we update that card and if we don't have BIOS support. I want to go through some of that to address some questions we've been having about that. And I want to show you what will happen, what we can expect. So right now, we need to update this BIOS. And we are in advanced mode, so I will press F2. We will go to easy mode. And if you notice here on the upper left-hand corner, the TRX40 Designare, we're using a Ryzen Threadripper. This is a Threadripper 3. We're using a 3970 32-core processor with 256 gigs of RAM. And our memory, this is DDR4 3200 at 2133. And the XMP Profile correct right now is DDR4 3200. And since I'm not sure where we stand with that BIOS for F4Q, since it's not listed on the website right now, I'm going to go ahead and do F4. Because remember, a lowercase letter with Gigabyte denotes it is a beta BIOS. And that was a consternation we had with a few BIOSes back. Now, I normally go through the forums, the Gigabyte forums, and get feedback on that. But that's the people I've been relying on have been a little preoccupied doing other things. I understand that. And some of the other people that have been involved are a little bit toxic. I'll just leave it at that. So since I haven't had any feedback, I'm hoping there won't be any issues, but I'm going to step through these. And even if it looks like I may be stepping back, remember, what I have right now is a beta BIOS. It works, but I'm going to go through this final BIOS, F4, and then I'll go up to the other BIOS. Now, normally, whenever you step through a BIOS, you want to power the machine down, pull power, drain it, make sure it's clear. Okay, at the very least, do that when you're completely finished. Personally, I prefer to do that as I go through each BIOS because I don't want anything left up in memory. Now, I'm telling you about this because once we get through with the second BIOS update, after we go through the power cycle, when we come back up, I need to go into the BIOS and turn all my custom settings back on. Memory, anything to do with booting from the unified UEFI versus booting from the BIOS. And that's something else we may have to get into because I'm getting questions about that because people are saying they want to turn stuff on. But if you didn't do it in the beginning when you installed Windows and you've got an MBR versus a GPT, then there's a bunch of steps you have to go through to get back up so you can get that system to boot. Everything's fine. It's just there's steps you have to go through. So we may deal with some of that. But right now, let's get this BIOS done. And one note I want to interject, remember, Gigabyte has a dual BIOS. We're only going to do the primary BIOS because worst case scenario, we can get back and get the system up on the backup BIOS. So I like that safety net, and I think it's worth mentioning. So let's do this. All right, we are F4Q. I have loaded a memory stick when I booted the system, so we should be able to go over here to Q Flash F8, and we have Update BIOS and Save BIOS. And it shows here the BIOS date was 4/12/2021 for F4Q, and all we need to do is update, and we're only going to update the primary. So the first thing I need to do is go to the directory the files are at, and I have the F4Q, which is the previous that's already here. I'm going to change it to the F4 just to be clear. It highlights, shows the F4. Now over here I'll go ahead and press update. Are you sure you want to update the BIOS? I'm going to say yes. Another dialog box will pop up once it verifies and asks, do you want to do the backup BIOS? Right here at the bottom. Also update the backup BIOS. No, I'm not going to do that. So I'm going to press start and we're going to update the primary BIOS. And once this BIOS is updated, and I want to leave this screen up, bring it back up and update the BIOS again. And then we'll go into the BIOS and put all our custom settings back up. Now another question has come up from some people with different motherboards, specifically on the X79 chipset, which is Intel, asking about bifurcation. Okay, we have bifurcation in this BIOS. For those of you that do not have bifurcation, that technology is about 4 years old. You would need a BIOS mod. We don't do that. We don't advise that because you can brick a motherboard even with the correct BIOS. But if you still want to go down that route and reallocate resources for that purpose, and the purpose of bifurcation is to be able to install a quad card, then do a search. You'll find people that do that for you. They will send you the code. You have to tell them specifics about your motherboard model, brand, and revision and chipset. And then they can supply that information. But be forewarned, if you brick it, you're on your own. Updating BIOS is 73%. Pretty straightforward process. Says this BIOS date is 7/27. So we're coming from 4/12 to 7/27. Reboot in 3, 2, 1. Now, the system shuts down because it's going to reset itself. And when it comes back up, as it does in interrogation, once we hear the post code, because we have the power on self-test speaker attached, then we'll go back and do it again. Going through a power cycle for a BIOS update, and number 2, going through a power cycle when you update the firmware on an M.2 NVMe drive is extremely crucial. Post. Now as soon as the BIOS is back up, we'll step through the next one. Back in, easy mode, top left, F4, and I'm not going to go through and look at the details, and if you notice it says XMP is disabled. So we'll get to that in a minute. No point in touching anything until we get to where we want to be. So we're going to go back over here to QFlash again, F8. We're going to update the BIOS again. We'll go to that directory, and this time we're going to go for the beta BIOS F5a. It highlights, and we're going to say, let's do this. Are you sure you want to update the BIOS? Yes. Wow, verification that time went a whole lot quicker. Also, you want to pay attention when your BIOS updates are occurring, because a lot of times what you'll see is the file, however they have listed on the website, may be different sizes. Let me show you what I'm talking about. For example, this shows here the F3 was 5.98 megabytes, the F4 was 6.01, and the F5a, it says here, was 6.02, and also gives the date. Depending on what may have occurred for the changes, for example, over here on the right, this said add a default status of AMD PSP for the virtual FTPM. So the virtual TPM is for Windows 11 for security requirements. If that's all we get, that's not really check and set for yourself, but I'm just pointing that out. We do not get an errata document like we used to, and that's kind of a bummer. So we have no idea of all the nooks and crannies a BIOS is updating. That's why I point that out. So step through those BIOS updates for success. I've noticed it's extremely crucial, again to reiterate, motherboards that have Thunderbolt built onto the motherboard. Now for us, our Thunderbolt card is separate, and I'm concerned about that integration, so that's why I'm doing the BIOS updates. Then we're going to go do the firmware update on the Thunderbolt card. But I got an experiment I'm going to try, because I'm going to do this to answer some other questions. We're going to do it without the pinner, without the head-out pinner that attaches to the motherboard. But we'll get to that. Let's go back to this BIOS. Press to start, update the BIOS, and I like to leave this on so you can see what's going on. So we're going from a BIOS date F4 of 7/7/27/2021 to a BIOS date of 10/20/2021. And this is the most current BIOS that we have. And I should have done this sooner, but we've been kind of busy doing other stuff, answering subscriber questions. And I promised when we found the other Thunderbolt card that we would update it, so this needs to occur first. And I'll be curious to see if we encounter any other, I don't want to say anomalies, but anything else that's enabled in the BIOS that we were not aware of. And again, to reiterate, we are not touching the backup BIOS, just in case. And for those that ask, okay, when would you update the backup BIOS? I would give the BIOS you've got that you're running on probably 2 or 3 months and see how things perform. Because what you might do the next time another BIOS update occurs, update the backup BIOS. In other words, write the current BIOS file, let it back up, then before you go to the current BIOS file. Won't hurt anything. Okay, reboot. I'll go ahead and say let's do this. System powers down for a reset. It'll come back up, and when it does, it goes through the code. And we know we've got video, we've got GPU power, we've got power on the LEDs to this add-in card. That's the Amplitech Squid. We can also see our BIOS postcodes up here, and we'll hear our power on self-test speaker up here. We'll know we're good. And as soon as we hear that, we'll go back in, do our custom settings. But we should be ready to go the next step. But I like to document all these features. You have to remember, this is the Threadripper 3. So this is the 3rd generation. On the TRX40 3rd generation, 1st and 2nd generation, we're on the X399. And when we go to the WRX80, that is a 1st generation on the Threadripper Pro. Post, I think it's important to point that out so we maintain some perspective on what we're doing with the technology. Leading edge versus bleeding edge, cutting edge technology. This is current technology, PCI Express 4. And we need to start talking about some purpose-built computers because some questions have arisen from some of the things we talked about. So I think we need to step back and take a look at that from the standpoint of a computer that I would stream with versus a computer that I would recommend for rendering, see what those differences are, or a computer that we'd use for a digital audio workstation. That question came up as well. So I got some information we'll share. Let's go back to the BIOS, but all that in another video. All right, first thing we've got, we are now on a beta BIOS, F5a. We're going to enable the XMP, which will require, if you noticed I tapped that once and twice, which will require a reboot. I will press F2. I'm going to go to advanced mode now. And if I go to boot, we see the individual drives, but all those drives, all 6 of those drives on the Amplitech Squid, from the WD Black SN850 to the Samsung 980 Pro, to all 4 of these Sabrent Rocket 4 2 terabyte drives. All 6 of those are on the Amplitech Squid. I should not be able to see them that way, but my default has been turned off. So we've got to go to Settings, and this is a multi-phase process. I/O ports. Okay, we have video on, blew everything out. Video on display 1, which is not there, doesn't matter, it'll find it because video is actually in PCI Express bus 16_2. What matters is PCI 8_1 because we have 2 16-lane slots and 2 8-lane slots, and that first 8-lane slot has to be bifurcated in the BIOS so we can see those drives. So I'm going to set that now. I like to point these little things out because sometimes people freak when things aren't working right. Now, yes, this is supposed to be automatic on PCI Express 4, but it is not. So we will set 4x4, and that gives us, which is pretty wicked when you think about it, because that gives us our 8 lanes for 6 drives. Remember, PLX chip. Okay, on the card. Okay, and PCI Express bus 16_2 to reiterate, that's where the GPU is at. It's fine. I don't need to set that. It would boot faster if I did, but I leave it. And if and when we put the RS quad adapter in, we'll have to come back and reset that, but I don't need to touch it now. Resize bar support, I'm going to leave off because I'm not going to use that integration because we move stuff around, but it's there. What I now see, of course, is Thunderbolt. That all has to be reset, and those were set back to the defaults. And those need to be at 256, so I should be able to type 256. Go to the next one, 256. Okay. A lot simpler than having to go in and hit the menu and scroll down. All right, so those are set. No security is set. And these are the settings that I cannot get to if I have no BIOS support. In other words, if I don't have that pinout header on that motherboard, they won't sense each other and see what's going on. Now, I've been doing some looking at that and some experimentation, and in the next video I'm going to show you about Thunderbolt. That's the experiment we're going to try. We're going to try that Thunderbolt card in that machine without that header plugged into the motherboard. It will be as if the motherboard has no support, and see what happens. We did it on the X399. We had partial support. We showed that. But instead of simplifying things, it just created more questions. Not problems, but questions. So I want to do it on this TRX40 Let's see what happens, because if it works, that means any TRX40 can have Thunderbolt 3. And the next progression, what about Thunderbolt 4? I don't know yet, but that's something still to be determined. A lot of this stuff, remember, test and verify. So we'll escape that menu. Now we have to go into our other setting, because if you'll notice, there's a menu in here that we need for RAID. It's not there, and it won't be there till we reboot. So I'm taking advantage of this. So I'm going to go to SATA configuration, press enter. SATA mode is AHCI. NVMe RAID mode is off. I'm going to turn that on, and the question will ask, can you have a SATA RAID and an NVMe RAID in the same machine? Yes, but remember they have to be separate. You can have this RAID and this RAID, but you can't combine those two. They have to be separate. We only need the one. We only need NVMe. The other thing I like, and this used to be, and I don't know why, 10-year-old computers, we could set this individually, but now, and we lost it on the X399, but now on the TRX40, it's auto. Well, we should be able to set that individually. And if you'll notice, if I try to scroll to these drives, I can't. It'll show me what's on the port, but it won't let me go to the port and configure it for hot plug, hot swap. It's auto or nothing, which I think is kind of dumb, but my point of view, my perspective. And if you notice here in the bottom left, it says here, enable, disable, SATA, port, hot plug, all or nothing. Escape. Now the other menu we need will come up after we go through a reboot. So I'm going to tab over to boot, just to double check. I'm going to press F10, and it shows the changes I've made. PCI Express by 8_1 bifurcation has been changed to manual. Memory allocation has been set from 128 to 256 and from 32 to 256. And to reiterate, if we don't have BIOS support, we can't set those memory apertures. And what does that mean? Well, if you plug in multiple Thunderbolt devices, you would not be able to set that memory allocation. And what you might have is the device will connect and then disconnect. So you should be able to connect one device without BIOS support, but don't expect multiple devices to connect and stay connected. Okay, the next step that has to be done, and this is part of the optimization, is this is high performance. That's a high performance interface. So you don't want that to go to sleep, which deals with the wait states, the sleep state. You want that set all for high performance so that machine stays on. If you let the machine go to sleep and come back up, chances are you'll lose connectivity with the device. You'll have to go through a power cycle to bring it back up and refresh it. So I'm just pointing that out. So the next thing we set in the BIOS, NVMe RAID, we've enabled that, and the chipset SATA hot port, hot plug, hot swap, we've turned that on. So we will say yes, reboot, and then once we go through the power on self-test again, we can go back into the BIOS. We'll have one more menu where we can go in and we can look at the RAID that's been set up. Now, we've always talked about there's three types of RAID. There's the hardware RAID. We did a video on that. Then there's the software RAID, which is either a hybrid BIOS bootable RAID, which is what we have because it's bootable, or an operating system RAID. Okay, there's another RAID that we're going to be talking about. It's made by G-RAID, and I'm going to leave it at that and put a link in the description to kind of whet your appetite. I'd hoped we might get to look at that card, but I think it's premature for us to look at it on this platform. If we get the chance to build on the WRX80, that's where I think we need to show it. Here the post, power on self-test, back into the BIOS, menu is up, and we are at check the boot. Yep, okay, now it shows the Windows Boot Manager, good. It also shows the flash drive still plugged in. It should bypass that. I'll unplug it because we're going to go through another boot. So let's go to settings. We'll go to I/O ports, enter. Now we have the RAID Expert configuration utility. And that means that our RAID will be functional. I'm going to go ahead and go into the menu just to look. I don't need to mess with anything, but I just want to verify that we see our drive, that we see our RAID array. Press enter. Controller management, enter. View controller information, and we see. Let's go down to controller physical disk count 1, total physical disk count 6, array count 2. And if I were to keep this, I need to reset that, but I have 6 drives on there, 4 2 terabyte and 2 1 terabyte. I treated that like JBOD, and I shouldn't have. What that needs to be is reset one RAID. All the drives need to be the same capacity, otherwise they default to the lower capacity. So I can have one RAID array on the Amplitech Squid, but I need 2 more 2 terabyte drives. I may have a couple, but I'll have to destroy what's on one of the drives to be able to use it. I may do that later in another video, but I'm mentioning this now in case the question comes up, because I'm sure it will. Hope that helps. I try to edit these and keep them tight for clarity, but sometimes I may miss things because I'm trying to hit the high points. So I'm going to escape. I don't need to do any more. All I need to do now, as I look at the boot menu, I'm good with that. But what I do want to do is power down the system because I haven't done a complete power off. So we're going to do that first so we can do the reset, and then we'll go into Windows, make sure everything's good. So I press F10, save configuration and exit, and then it'll come back up, and as soon as I hear it go through the post, then I'm going to press the power button to turn it off. But I want to get to post because we're going to power down and drain it. I want to thank you guys again for watching. Heard the post? I'm holding down the power button. Okay, system shut down. I'll turn it off. Drain power by holding the power button. Power's drained. Unplug to verify. We're good. Okay, now I'll pull out the thumb drive that had the BIOS update. Guys, those things get hot. Now when we come back up, everything should be clear. We should be good to go. I was surprised that everything in the BIOS that I just set was good to go. A lot of times when you go through some of those power cycles, something will still be in memory and something will be odd. Apparently they've set that BIOS update now that when it powers down and powers back up, it flushes, which is a nice feature because I don't remember seeing that before. I wanted to point that out. So we'll turn it on, power up, we're good. And we can see everything coming on. We've got power to the GPU, we've got power to the Amplitech Squid, we can see our postcodes, and we're going to hear our PC speaker in a minute when it does the power on self-test. And everything's good to go. I don't need to go into the BIOS, but I want to boot the computer into Windows and make sure we're set. It's interesting this time it did 2 power on self-tests. The first one, after I powered down, it came up and I see the Gigabyte ultra durable screen. Then it recycled again and went through another power on self-test, apparently to re-enumerate the devices. That was a good sign. Good. Because of the relationship of all these cards that are involved in what's going on, it's extremely important that occurred. And we're up. Let's take a look. And we have a desktop. I'll do a Windows flag E. Let's do this PC. And we see the first RAID array 1 on C drive, and we see the second RAID array. And to reiterate, I can have all those in one RAID. All I have to do is make sure all the drives are the same size. So we're up and running. So we may address that in another video because it's one thing to have these quad cards. A lot of people are really interested in RAID, but there needs to be some way to manage the RAID where it's not, there's issues with hardware RAID. There's opportunities, but there's issues. And with doing a hybrid BIOS RAID, again, it's dependent upon the BIOS. What we need is the solution, and I think G-RAID is the answer to manage the RAID. And the way they do it, it's pretty phenomenal, but you've got to have a slot for it. And I'm not sure it'll work with a 8-lane slot. I think it may, but the solution we're looking at works with a 16-lane slot. So I've got to have to do what I'm thinking about for 4 quad cards. Yeah, 4 quad cards times 4 is 16. Okay, this solution will work with up to 32 drives. So the question that we've always asked, do you use 4 quad cards or do you use 4 of the 8 drive cards? Now my concern about the 8 drive cards, they have a PLX chip, that's a bottleneck. So I think to get full bandwidth on the bus, and especially to interact with this card from G-RAID, I think we need the quad cards. But we've got to have, and that's a lot of drives. So I'm looking how we're going to figure out how to put that together, but that would be a purpose-built computer for someone that needs RAID to have something like, boy, would that make a fantastic digital audio workstation? Yeah. Would that make an incredible machine for rendering on? Yeah. But I think the digital audio workstation would benefit from it the most. So it's something we're looking at. I wanted to share that with you. Next video, Gigabyte Titan Ridge Thunderbolt 3, Revision 2, firmware update. I want to thank you for watching. My name is Gil Boyd. This is BuildOrBuy. We're on the next video. We're out.